or Coulee Ranch as it was known, was an important way station for the Fort Apache soldiers and freighters traveling from Snowflake and Taylor to Show Low in 1879. There were alternate routes between Taylor and Show Low, with the most direct route being on the east side of Show Low Creek. This trail was over volcanic rock material, which made traveling difficult during the rainy season. The black soil stuck to the wagon wheels to such an extent that the wheels locked against the wagon beds. Because of this, an alternate route along the west side of Show Low Creek was established. This new route entailed a longer journey for travelers, but the sandy gravel soil made it possible to use in any weather. The best farming land in the Show Low Valley had been claimed by the Corydon E. Coulee Ranch. The first Mormons into the Show Low area chose to establish a settlement that was on the longer road to Fort Apache, about 3 miles northwest of Coulee Ranch. Thomas and Jefferson Adair and his wife Mary were the first to make their home here in 1879. As the Adairs were joined by other Mormon families, a settlement was established which became known as Adair. At one time, as many as 12 families called the small village home. Today, this area lies to the northwest of the city of Show Low and is located within the Show Low city limits. The area is now referred to as Fool Hollow Lake Recreation Area and is the seasonal home of travelers from around the world. Most fishermen and campers who enjoy the area do not suspect that the silent, cold lake waters cover the early day village known as Adair. Most of the farms and homes lie well below the water, and only a few gravestones overlooking it all have survived. The Adairs and their neighbors lived mostly by raising livestock and farming. A log cabin was built in the village and served as both a school and a church. John Oliver was the first school teacher. Another important building for the early settlers was called the Smallpox House. Epidemics of diphtheria, scarlet fever, and smallpox took old and young folks alike. The Smallpox House was used to isolate the afflicted, and only those who had already survived the pox could tend to them. Water was of extreme importance to the Adair settlers, even though the community was located near Show Low Creek. One of the early settlers, Llewellyn Harris, witched for a well by using a Y-shaped willow from a willow tree. This branch, when held by the two prongs, would indicate an underground water source. Harris used this age-old method to determine that water could be found on a rocky hillside, and his water witching method was successful in the location of water for a well. In 1882, word was received by the scattered families that a band of renegade Apaches were threatening all Anglo settlers in the White Mountains. They were advised to prepare themselves and their families for an attack and build a lumber fort-like enclosure around Corydon E. Coulee's home, 3 miles from Adair. Some families chose to move to this fort, and others went on to Taylor or Snowflake for the duration of the Indian scare. Over the next several years, a large log building was constructed in Adair. This building included gun ports that could be used to protect the community. This fort was also used as a meeting house and as a school for early settlers. The fort, shown in the background, was later moved into the town of Show Low and was located on the Edson Whipple property near the present-day McDonald's. Though it was used as a barn and later as a house, the original gun ports in the logs remained intact. The building was destroyed in the 1970s. The Indian troubles experienced by the settlers in Adair were a thing of the past after 1882, but the memories lingered. Maud Jarvis remembered that when we first moved to Adair as children, we were really frightened at the sight of a single file string of Apache Indians on their ponies walking along the field fence. Her brother Jesse, age 8, and George, age 5, got their pet pony out of the stable and led him to the granary steps at the back of the house and locked him in the granary. However, according to Maud, it didn't take long for them to get over their fright, and before long they were running and playing with Indian children. Maud Jarvis also added that several of the squaws took a great liking to her curly, yellow-headed, blue-eyed baby brother Joseph, and they tried to get her mother to give him to them. Willard Whipple came to Adair in 1882 as a young single man. In 1884, he and Emma Oliver were married in Adair and lived in a 2-room log cabin which he had built. It was here that their first child, a son, was born and died on the same day. 4 years later, Willard homesteaded land just west of Adair, which is now part of the Show Low Country Club, and used it as a dry land farm. For many years, Willard hauled most of the water used by the family. He often loaded 4 to 6 barrels into his horse-drawn wagon and drove them 2 miles to a pond formed by the Show Low Creek. He would drive the entire wagon into the pond and fill each barrel with water, 1 bucket at a time. 8 children were born to Willard and Emma in this home. Their daughter Lydia remembered that the log home with mud cheating was pretty humble, with only the necessary furniture of beds, chairs, tables, and cupboards. The floors were of soft pine, with no coverings except in the front room where there was a homemade woven carpet. The ceiling throughout the cabin was covered with unbleached muslin fabric, which always sagged, but served to keep most of the dirt and insects out. Henry Mills and his wife, Anne Allen, both natives of England, joined the Adair settlement in 1883. Mills was the only man in Adair to subscribe to a newspaper. It came by mail once a week, and folks throughout the community came to his house to hear the news. In 1889, Jesse J. Brady was appointed as the first postmaster in Adair. He and his wife, Mahatable Brady, both Mormons and natives of Georgia, cared for the government horses and ran a small store and post office. The foundation stones of that store were clearly visible when Fool Hollow Lake was drained a few years ago for repairs to the dam. By 1894, Joseph W. Smith of Snowflake held a contract for the U.S. mail from Holbrook to Fort Apache with a way station in Adair. The Hebert Jarvis family was responsible for supplying the extra horses at this stop, as well as managing a small store and keeping the mail buckboards in repair. Mrs. Jarvis also cooked for passengers who rode the mail wagon and other passers-by. In 1895, 16-year-old William Bill Oliver began driving the horse-drawn mail wagon from Adair to Fort Apache. He was on the road 10 to 12 hours each day and received $2.50 per trip. The Adair post office was discontinued in July of 1906. In 1903, 6 Mormon men pooled their resources to take advantage of the possibility of buying Show Low Valley, 3 miles southeast of Adair, which is the present site of downtown Show Low. The price was $13,500, and the total was divided into 4 1/2 shares. William J. Flake, James C. Owens, John Henry Willis, Abner and Frank Ellsworth, and Niels Hansen Sr. purchased Show Low Valley. When this purchase was completed, the men offered to split the land and sell to outlying settlers. Most of the Adair settlers took advantage of this, as the scattered dryland farms they had been struggling on for the past 25 years had not proved to be very productive. There are several versions of how the name Fool's Hollow, or Fool's Holler as the old-timers called it, became attached to the present-day recreation area. One version was that people began calling it Fool's Hollow since only a fool would attempt to farm there. Another more colorful version of the name origin tells a story of a group of young people who were out for a horse and buggy ride. According to this version, the young man who owned the horse became angry and rode home alone on his horse, leaving the others sitting in the buggy like fools. The area became known as Fool's Hollow after the last of the Mormon families moved into the town of Show Low and left only the Adair Cemetery to mark their passage there. The old cemetery, now on private land, remains to tell the story of families who struggled to make Adair their home. Reading the stones, we can see the names of settlers who traveled across seas and plains to this final resting place. Each family, from the earliest of pioneers, made sorrowful journeys to a cemetery hill, and their names are all there: Whipple, Ellsworth, Oliver, Hall, Merrill, and McNeil, among others. Epidemics of diphtheria, scarlet fever, smallpox, and various accidents took old and young alike. Etta Jane Colvin, 9 years old, died of diphtheria in 1883. She was the first to be buried in the Adair Cemetery. Edson and Rowena Whipple brought 7 of their children to Adair. The small, neatly lettered headstones tell a bitter story, beginning with the death of 2-year-old Lavina Whipple in 1888. Rowena, who was 14 months old in 1900, 13-year-old Levi in 1905, and Lester, 5 months old, in 1911. In 1920, the Whipples buried 2 more sons here, within 1 month of each other as a result of their service during World War I. Except for the occasional trip to leave a loved one in the old cemetery, this land lay relatively uninhabited for 70 years, and nature reclaimed her own. The area was described as one of the most pristine and beautiful settings on the Mogollon Rim Plateau. And so, in the 1950s, the Foo No S Hollow Lake Recreation Project was begun, and a dam was constructed on Show Low Creek, creating a lake which covered the last vestige of the village of Adair.